Hi everyone, this is Tim Clapham for FX PhD, the After Effects for Broadcast Design course. This is week 2, class 2. This week we'll be looking at particle systems, how particle systems work, and then we'll be looking at some practical solutions. Finally in the lesson we'll build a 5-second sequence and we'll kind of use the particle systems we've discussed to build some effects, etc. As I said, we're going to create an animation at the end. Here's a little preview of the animation that we're going to create. But before we get started on that, I'm just going to have a quick look through some of the particle systems and just a brief explanation of how they work. Okay, so what exactly is a particle system? I'm sure a lot of you already know, but I'm going to run through the basics quickly just for those of you that aren't actually familiar with it. So I'm just going to select this solid and add Simulation Particle Systems 2. Now this is part of the cycle effects that comes with After Effects, so all of you should have this. Okay, if we open that up we can't actually see anything, but if we just do a round preview, there we go. Not all particle systems work the same, they all have their own quirks and their own unique features, but essentially they all work on the principle that they generate lots of particles. Now a particle is essentially just a point in space, whether that's 2D or 3D space, and then to that point you can attach shapes, layers, etc. Once you've done that you can then control the particles, and that might be using other layers to affect it, or with some physics that are built into the effect, so you can have gravity, wind, etc. So Particle Systems 2 is a 2D particle system. There are other types. There are 3D particle systems. There are some that are based on grids, some that kind of emit from the layer. You'd be surprised how many particle systems there are actually in After Effects. Even things like shatter is a particle system essentially. So to generate the particles you normally have what's called an emitter. Now that could be a point, or it could be a grid or a cube. That's where all the particles are generated from. Now with some particle systems, particles then have a lifespan, so you can set how long that particle is alive for, and then you can set certain properties for the duration of its life. Let's just have a quick look at the settings for Particle Systems 2. Here we have birth rate, so that's how fast it's going to emit particles. Longevity, 2 seconds, that's essentially the life of each particle. So then we come to the producer, this is the emitter. So here we can set the position of it and also the X and Y size. Then we have physics. These are just parameters that control what happens to the particles once they're born. And finally we have the particle settings. Here we can set what type of particle, colour, things like that. So here the particle emitter, or the producer as it's called on this effect, is a point. The physics animation type is explosive and the particle type is a line. I mean, it's all pretty clear and obvious. So let's just change a few of those to see what happens. Okay, so what I've done here is I've just adjusted the radius of the emitter, so it's 150 wide, switched off gravity, changed the particle type to bubble, and I've actually slowed the velocity of them down slightly. As you can see, it's a totally different effect. This is Particle World. It's cult effects or cycle effects. It's very similar to Particle Systems 2. It's got a few extra features, most notably the fact that it's 3D. You can use it based on the comp camera, which is what I've done here. As you can see, it looks very similar. Again, we've got the same kind of particle types and the same kind of emission types. Let's just have a look at what other features it offers. One of the cool features is that you actually have a grid that you can use as a floor, so if you're actually comping particles into some live action you can use that to line it up with the floor. It's got some properties. Here we're just using the bounce property. It can also be kind of ice where it slides across it, or it can stick, or it can just ignore the floor. So that's quite a cool feature. Notice as well that in this particle system I've set up a custom particle. Now the thing with custom particles as well is that you can actually animate them, so you can create things like flocks of birds flying, shoals of fish, things like that. Here's a kind of rather poor example of the classic sort of fairy dust thing that we all know and love, which is probably one of the most overused particle techniques in Hollywood. But yeah, it looks pretty and it's cool and we love it. This is another particle system that comes with After Effects. You can find it under Effects Simulation Foam. primarily designed for kind of creating bubbles and things like that, but it also has lots of other uses. It's got a few unique parameters, such as wobble amount, repulsion, viscosity, and stickiness. Again, you can see it works similar to the other. There's a particle point. Up here we can set the size of the emitter point, and we can also animate it moving around. With this particle system, you can use some of the preset bubbles, or you can also use custom particles. I'm just going to set it to a custom particle for now. There we go. Here's an example of using foam with some type. Yeah, it's a bit cheesy, but in the right circumstances it could be very useful. There's a couple of layers here and a few effects that I've added on as well. You'll have this project file so you can tear that apart in your own time. I'm just going to show you one other feature of foam, and that's flow maps, and they're really useful. So what I mean by flow maps is something like you can see on the screen here. It's a black and white image, and or should I say grayscale really, and it's used to kind of guide the particles. So what will happen is they'll only stay in the black area. Now this is really useful if you need to do, for instance, medical animations or kind of showing information travelling, stuff like that. So I'll just show you how that works. You take the flow map, you put it in with your particle in the same comp, and you just hide it, and then you set it in the effect to use that layer as a map. So I've got a simple comp set up here with the solid at the top with foam applied. As you can see, it's spewing out particles. They're just randomly going in all directions. If we then go to the effect in the effects controls and set our flow map, you can see the difference. So you just go up here, select foam map, and now you can see that the particles are all contained within that black area. So you're basically defining a path for them to travel along. It's a pretty nifty feature. So as a kind of crude example, I've just created an arrow as a custom particle. So if I just set that, we go to user defined, and then we select arrow. Okay, and up here we just need to select this as rendered. There we go. So at the moment the orientation of the arrow is not changing at all, but you can actually adjust that as well. In here we have bubble orientation, it's fixed. If you go to bubble velocity, okay, you can now see that the arrows are pointing in the direction of travel. So hopefully you can see some uses for that kind of thing. One more particle system we're going to have a quick look at, and then we're going to dive into building the project. There are loads of particle systems in After Effects, but we're not going to look at them all because obviously that would take up the whole lesson, and we'd rather look at some more practical uses. The last one is card dance. Now, some may argue it's not really a particle system, although it is, or isn't it? I mean, essentially it's an array. Those of you familiar with Cinema 4D and the MoGraph module, card dance is very similar to kind of using cloner and shader effector. So what it does is it splits up your layer into rows and columns, and then you can control those squares or whatever is left over, and you can control them with other layer maps. The layer maps can look at the intensity or the luminance values, or it can also look at the red, green and blue values, and by animating those you can control the position, rotation, scale of the kind of cards. So how does it work? The way it works is you specify the number of rows and columns. You can also specify a back layer, so if the cards flip round you can have a different image on the other side. And then we have these two gradient layer pop-up lists. This is where we can choose the layer that we want to affect the cards. Down here we have all the parameters that can be affected. Okay, so at the moment the X scale and the Y scale is set to intensity 1. The intensity 1 means gradient layer 1, and it's going to use the intensity or luminance from that layer. In the comp I've got a layer called map grey. If we switch that on you can see it's just plain grey. That's actually 50% grey, I think. Let's have a look. I'll just pull up my info. Alright, it's 166, so it's going towards white, which is great, that's what we want. So if we just select our card dance layer, and then we select gradient layer 1 map, you can immediately see the effect it has. It's scaled all the cards down slightly. So essentially these maps are the key to card dance. So what I've done is I've just set up a few examples of how you can create those to just generate some different effects. Once we've had a look at that, we'll get on with building the main project. So in this example I've used fractal noise and generated this map here, which is kind of fiery. And then I'm going to use that to displace and scale the tiles on card dance. So we switch off that layer, switch on card dance, you can see what's happened here. If we go to the effects, so we have that gradient layer as our first selection. We have the Z position using that multiplier 1. We can adjust these parameters to kind of adjust the strength of the effect. We also have X rotation, Y rotation and Z rotation. So what that means is as the particles move in Z space, they'll also be rotating. And we've also set scale. So that will kind of scale the particles up and down depending. Now if the map is 50% grey, it will have no effect on the particles at all. If it's white, it will go one way. If it's black, it will go the other way. Think of it kind of like a displacement map. So with this example, it kind of gives a dodgy sort of fire looking effect. In the next example, I've used WaveWorld to generate the map. WaveWorld's a great plugin, especially for those of you that work in 3D. You can use it to make some great fluid displacement maps, but here is a bit of a kind of abstract use for it. So what I've done is I've just set it to kind of give it a slight rotation and adjust the X and Y scale, so as the ripples move across it gives us this sort of wacky technique. Again, they're all kind of ingredients that could be used in your motion graphic projects. Here's another example set up using WaveWorld. There's kind of lots of tiles on this one, and I've animated the number, and it's sort of like a wipe kind of thing, but it's really me just messing around. But you know, it's a pretty cool technique. You notice that also it's working with the comp camera perfectly well. It really is displacing those tiles in Z space, so it's not just an illusion. Great stuff. I'll just show you another couple of examples and then we're done. For this map, what I've done is used fractal noise set to block. Notice that it starts at 50% grey, so it won't be affecting the tiles in card dance at all. I'll just give you a round preview of the map first of all. So I've kind of animated the position of the fractal noise and the size of it. Okay, so let's see what that does to our card dance layer. Here we go, I'll just round preview that for you. Okay, you can see it kind of breaks up and dissolves. It's like a transition almost. Well, hopefully these examples I've shown you will kind of give you some impetus to open up those plugins and mess around with them a bit yourself. Now what we're going to do is we'll move on to building the final animation. So for this project we've been approached by a broadcast company. They're producing a kind of youth TV program. It's going to have different sections in it for films that are on, music, that kind of thing. Now what they want is some little 5-second stings just to sort of be the titles for each of these sections. So we're going to go through making one of those. The client has sent us some artwork. We haven't got any storyboards this time. We know that each one's going to be 5-second duration and one of the sections is films. This is what they've sent us. Okay, it's not quite as bad as the storyboard. It's a bit plain and simple. The instructions we've got with it is that they kind of want it like this, but the film to look more prestigious and also to be in 3D space with some spotlights, etc. around. So let's go about building this. One thing they did say is that the names of the sections may well change, so we need to bear that in mind when we're building the project. So this is what it looks like in Illustrator. If we jump to After Effects, we'll have a look at what it's going to look like once the project's completed. There we go. Now that looks a bit better. So how do we go about building this? The first thing we need to do really is to set the type. We need to build that in a way so that if the type changes, we can easily adapt that and put it into our project later. We don't really want to be having to redo it all. As you can see, the word is made up of lots of little stars, and there's also little red discs behind each star as well. So first of all, we'll make the title and then we'll bring it into the scene and set up the 3D. Here's the text set up in Illustrator. I've done it like that so that we can import that and create comp in After Effects. If we need to change the copy, we can change it in the Illustrator file, and that will kind of ripple through our After Effects project and hopefully won't make the changes too painful. So what I've done is I've imported that into After Effects and put it in a comp on its own. You notice that the film text is 50% grey. That means that if we use it with card dance, it's not actually going to affect the tiles at all, which is what we want to start with. As I say, I've set that up in a comp. That's just the Illustrator file, but the comp looks pretty much exactly the same as well. So now what I'm going to do is go about making a grid of dots and a grid of stars so we can use that, and then we'll cut the word film out of it. First of all, I'm just going to click up here and create a new comp. I'm going to call this film transition. It's going to be PAL, widescreen, and I'm going to set it to 10 seconds, even though the overall animation is only going to be 5. That's fine. I'm going to add in a black solid and also this grey solid. The reason I'm adding the grey solid will just it will become obvious in a moment. I'm just going to switch this off for now, select the black solid and apply card dance. Actually, thinking about it, it'd probably be better to put that on the grey solid, so I'll just swap that over. If we open up the card dance effect and select the gradient layer just to be grey solid 1, and I'm just going to set the X and Y scale to use that layer. Okay, and now we can see our tiles. Set that to -2, -2. The reason I'm doing this is just for a guide, just to lay out my grid. I'm working in PAL, which is 1024 by 576. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to 57 and the columns to 102. That will mean that all my tiles are squares and it will evenly fit into this size comp. You can easily kind of do the maths on that for any comp that you're working on. Just going to set these multipliers slightly lower so I can see the tiles more clearly. And what I'm going to do is use this comp as a guide. Because card dance doesn't really work like traditional particle systems, normally you just kind of create one particle and then it would distribute it to all the others. With card dance you need to make a grid for it to work with. That's why I've set up the card dance comp, so I can then bring it into here and I can use it to position my graphics. So what I've done on this one is I've just created a shape layer which has got an ellipse. You can just see it up here. I've positioned it in the position of the first tile, and now I'm going to just use the repeater to repeat it all the way to the end and then repeat that again down to the bottom. The great thing with this is that we can just change our one shape and it will iterate through all the clones, as it were. So if we just open up the shape layer and have a look at what we've got an ellipse, it's set to 9, that's fine, okay, and now what we're going to do is just add a repeater. Now what a repeater does is it repeats the shape. We know that this is going to be 102 wide, so we want 102 copies. Now the distance between them is wrong, so to adjust that we can go down to the repeater transformation parameters and we can adjust this position here. As you can see, as I scrub that value, the gap between them comes smaller. If we set that to 10, I think we'll find that's about right. It's not quite right. As you can see, it's just slipped off here, so this does take a tiny amount of adjusting. Just going to scrub that value. I think it'd probably be better to do it manually. So I'm just going to set that value. So the value in the end was 10.035, and that seems to have distributed the circles evenly across this top set of tiles. So the next thing we do is just add another repeater to repeat that row to create the columns that we need. So we just go here, select repeater again, and this time in the transformation we need to adjust the Y value. We know that we need 57 copies, so let's set that first of all. If we zoom out slightly, you can see that it's still repeating it along X. We just switch that X value off. And then if we scrub this value, you can see that it's kind of repeating them down as well. So again, a little bit of small fine tuning here just to get the value right. Bear with me and I'll set that. So the value for that is 10.1, which is great. So now we've got our grid of circles. We also need a grid of stars to make up the word. The easiest way to do that is just to dupe the comp and then we can just change the shape. We don't need to change anything else. The repeaters will do their job fine on the new shape. The other thing I'm going to do is just delete the card dance comp out of here because that was there purely for setting it up. Here I've basically duped the dots comp and swapped it for a star. That's all we need to do. Again, as I said, if the client changes their mind and they don't want it as a star, we can just change the shape in here. It will iterate through all the repetitions and all should be good. So now we're just going to go back to our film transition, bring these in and use card dance with our film comp to cut the type out. This is our film transition comp. At the moment the grey solid's the solid with card dance, so if I'm just going to alt drag my stars comp to swap it over, press E for effect and open the card dance, and I'm just going to switch these values to none for now, so that none of the maps actually affect them. This grey solid isn't going to be used, so I'm just going to delete that out of here, and I'm now going to drag in my film text first of all. There it is, okay, and I'm also just going to hide that because we don't need to see it. If we open up the card dance effect and select our gradient layer to be the film text, just going to reset these multipliers to 1, which is the default value, and now I'm going to select intensity 1, which will use the intensity from the film text layer for the X and Y scale. There you go, you can see it's cut the letters out perfectly. So what do we do next? I'm going to wipe this on using another gradient layer. Now the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to kind of set the back layer so that it is set to none. At the moment, if we flip all these cards over, it will look exactly the same. Let's first of all just make the transition map. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use radio waves for that. So I've already set up a project. Let's just have a quick look at what radio waves is. Again, it's another kind of particle system. Open that up. Okay, so basically what radio waves does is it produces rings like this. Now they can be stars as well, or they can be based on the contours of an image, or they can also be based on a mask. You can set the expansion, the frequency, things like that. They also have kind of parameters like most particle systems, life. Let's just have a quick look at the radio waves effect. So you can see it's set to wave type polygon. This is where you can choose image contours or mask. And basically I've just put a box blur on it as well. So a quick preview of that and you can see what happens. So as we know, grey values won't affect the cards at all, but the black value will flip it all the way around, or it will scale it up. So if we put that into card dance, you can kind of visualise the effect that would happen. What I'm going to do is take this and then animate a mask in the middle of it, so we can use it as a transition to reveal the film text. In my radio waves transition comp, you can see it starts at black, which means that the cards will be fully affected. What I'm going to do is flip them, so that means they'll be flipped all the way around. If I just scrub through, you can see the radio waves come on as grey, so that will then turn the cards around to their normal position. At this point here, I've added in a solid and just animated the mask, so we end up at 50% grey, which should leave all our cards the right way round. So we need to go to our card dance comp, drag this in and then set the correct parameters. Back in the film transition comp, I've dragged in the radio waves transition comp that we were just making. So in the card dance effect, we can select that as one of our gradient layers. And if we go to X rotation, and we can select intensity 2, that's because this is gradient layer 2. Okay, we can't see any change at the moment. That's because where we are on the timeline. If we just scrub back, okay, there you go. You can see the kind of circles working. The multiplier is set to 90, which is kind of the number of degrees. So if we're in a 3D comp, we'd probably see those. That needs to be set to 180 so that they're flipped all the way around. As soon as we do that, we can see the back. So to get rid of that, we just switch this back layer parameter to none. Okay, so let's just RAM preview that and see what it looks like. And that seems to be working as expected. The great thing about this method is if the client wishes to change the transition, we can just bring in another map and it will look different. So the way of creating kind of lots of variations is pretty easy. Now we've got dots as well as stars, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the stars comp, select the lower one, come back to my project and just swap it with the dots comp. If we just solo that, we can now see that we've got film made out of dots. They're both using the same transition at the moment. So to get around that and to create something a little bit more special, I'm just going to duplicate this. I'm going to call this one O1 and O2. Switch solo off. At the moment they're kind of transitioning on together. If we switch to dots and pick up card dance, we can then just select transition O2, and if we move this along, you'll notice that it will offset the effect. So let's see what that looks like. Yeah, it looks pretty cool. I think I'm going to do it the other way around though, so the stars come on first, but I mean that's just a matter of preference. Overall the effect's working as expected so far. I've changed the bottom to map layers, so transition 1 is the one that starts slightly later. I think that's preferable because then the kind of stars are the last part to wipe on with the word film. Okay, so we've got that far. Now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of set up a sort of a fake reflection for it. So when we bring it into our 3D scene, it looks as if it's reflecting in the floor. Now we want this film to be sitting on the floor and reflecting in the floor, so what we're going to do now is we kind of make a fake reflection. First of all, I'm just going to drag the film transition to create a new comp and just rename that. Renamed it film reflection. It's just got the pre-comp from the film transition in there. I'm going to jump back to the film transition comp and just make a couple of slight adjustments. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag this layer down, he says, just so it sits on the bottom. Come back to our film reflection, we can drag that up again, and then if we just press Y, adjust the anchor point, and we put it at the very bottom of that layer. Next thing to do, duplicate this, select the bottom comp, open up scale, and set Y to -100. Okay, that's pretty good. I'm just going to nudge it down a couple. So there's our sort of reflection so far. It doesn't look very convincing, does it? What we need to do is perhaps blur it a little bit and add some fall off. To add the fall off, I'm simply going to use a kind of track matte. So I'm going to drag this solid in and set the opacity to about 50 so I can see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to just add the ramp effect. Let's generate ramp. Now what I need to do is just adjust the black and the white points so they're where I need them. I've adjusted those, press F4 and switch this to Luma matte. Okay, Luma inverted matte in this case. Now we can adjust the points of the ramp until we have the effect that we want. We're not seeing it very clearly because I've still got the opacity set to 50. Let's just up that to 100. There we go, that's better. So you can see the kind of letters sort of fade out. If we select ramp, we can adjust these parameters as we need to. I think that's probably just about right, and we'll just drop the opacity down, say 50, wrong layer of the actual layer below. Okay, it's starting to look a little bit more convincing. The next thing to do is to add some blur to that. Now in reality what would normally happen is the blur would kind of disperse more the further away from the surface the point being reflected is. So kind of like if you put your finger on a table, where the tip is it will be very sharp, but by the time you've reached the knuckle it's going to be pretty blurry. So what we can do is we can use the same gradient that we used for the track matte, and we can add a compound blur, and we'll use that. The only thing that we must bear in mind is that obviously compound blur is a compound effect, so we're going to need to pre-compose our ramp. So I'm just going to select that first of all, Shift Apple C, create a new comp, film gradient. Move all attributes into the new comp. There we go, it still works fine. We can switch it on, see that it's all good. If we select our film transition layer, effect blur and sharpen, compound blur, and we select film gradient as our blur layer, and reduce the amount of blur down to say 5. I think it needs to go even less than that. So I've set that to 1. I can see that it's blurring more here than it is here. I've got a funny feeling that I just need to invert the blur. There we go. Let's set that a little bit higher, 2.5. That's looking pretty good. I think the opacity of this bottom layer is still a little bit high. I'm going to just set that to 35. I'm also going to increase the blur a tiny bit more. Lastly, I'm just going to select these two layers and just parent them to the film transition. I'm not likely to move it, but now if I do move it, it all moves together. Cool, well that's a good point to save. I'm just going to increment and save, and then we'll move on bringing that into a 3D comp. Let's click on film title, Command N, new comp, asterisk, film, main, power widescreen, 5 seconds. Drag the film reflection comp into here. Let's move up a bit so we can see it. F4, make that a 3D layer. Now I'm just going to add in a camera. We'll just use these settings for now. Let's go for kind of 28mm. Okay. The camera move on this is going to be quite simple, but rather than animate the camera, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a couple of nulls and parent the camera to that so that I can kind of adjust it all in an easier way. So first of all, new null. Okay, and I'm just going to call this cam pitch. Duplicate that. Cam heading. And duplicate that and call it cam controller. Next thing to do is parent the camera to the cam pitch null, the cam pitch null to the cam heading null, and then the heading null to the cam controller. Select the cam controller. Add some effects to this. We're going to use expression controls here. Angle control first of all. I'm just going to rename the effect cam heading, duplicate that, cam pitch, and finally slider control, and we'll call this cam Z depth. The reason I've done that is just so that we can animate the camera just from this one layer. We'll have all our keys on one layer. Just makes things a little bit easier to work in the timeline. We can effectively shy the other layers and hide them. Before we do that, we're just going to have to set up the expressions. The expressions are pretty easy to set up, and we're just going to use the pick whip. So we open our rotation properties for these layers. You notice that I just need to switch them to 3D first of all. If we adjust the X rotation, you can see that because the camera's parented, it's affecting the pitch. So we just need to link this value to the effect on the cam controller. Select the cam controller, press E to open the effects. I'm just going to drop these down so we can see the parameter that we need to link to. Drag this up so we can see what we're doing. If we alt-click on the X rotation value, this gives us an expression. We can literally drag it onto our camera pitch angle. Now if we drag the effect, it's all working. So I'm just going to do the same for the heading. Open up rotation. This will be the Y rotation. As you can see, that's adjusting the heading of the camera. So again, alt click here, drag it to camera heading angle. Just check that that worked. Yeah, that all seems to be fine. So now we can kind of adjust the camera from this layer. The last expression to set up is the camera Z depth, so we can just fold these up, select the camera, hit P to bring up our position, alt click here and drag it to our Z depth slider. Now at the moment After Effects has created an expression for us. It's created a temporary variable called temp. It's then applied this value to the 3 position values. That's not exactly what we want. We only want to apply it to the last value. So the way to do that is just to put the word value in here for these 2 parameters, and then they'll take the value from here, whereas the last one will use this variable, which is coming from cam Z depth slider up here. So first of all, I'm just going to change the variable to Z, kind of makes more sense, and then we put the Z in here. And for these other 2 parameters, we just put in value. Square brackets O, because it's the first part of the array, comma, value 1, And now if we click off of here, as we scrub this value here, you can see it's only affecting the Z. So if we set that to say -1000 for now, we can fold this up, drag the comp down so we can see what's going on. If we select these 3 layers, hit shy, and we can shy them. We can do it all from our cam controller now. Now we can position the camera pretty easily using these sliders, so I'm just going to kind of roughly position it where I want. It's sort of something like this, and then we use the actual cam controller to, not like that. Now we can position the camera where we want it, which is kind of something around here. Maybe just zoom the camera out slightly more. Okay. It looks a bit lonely in there on its own, so let's go about adding in some other solids and effects to build a bit of an environment for it. First of all, let's add in a floor. So I'm just going to go new solid. I'm going to make this quite big, 2,500 by 2,500, and a very kind of dark red. Okay, switch that to 3D and just drag it down below. Hit R and let's just change its rotation to -90. Okay, now you can see that we have lost the reflection. That's because the two 3D layers are intersecting each other. So if we move this layer down, you can see that the reflection is still there, it's just getting clipped. Now there's a hack that you can do to get around that, which is part of the limitation of After Effects 3D, but it's also, you know, quite a cool feature. Basically, the 3D in After Effects all works together, but if you insert a 2D layer in between your 3D layers, then the 3D elements become kind of two separate things. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to put in a 2D layer in between. Let's just drag this in. I'm going to just set that as an adjustment layer so it doesn't actually do anything. And now the 3D from the film reflection sits above the 3D for the floor. Let's just rename this floor. And I'm going to add a mask to this layer and give it a big feather just so we sort of lose this really hard edge. We may need to come back and reposition and adjust this, but we'll wait until we've got a few more elements in the comp. So first of all, just select the ellipse tool, double click that, there we go, there's our mask. We can just zoom out slightly. The transform box looks a bit odd, but we just shift control, scale that down slightly. Press F and let's give it a feather of say 250. Okay. I'm going to add a light in as well. I'm going to make that a point light. I don't need it to cast shadows. I'm just going to call it point light. And click OK. Drag this up. Press T for intensity. Let's just set that to say 120. Slightly brighter. If we select the floor, press AA, that brings up our material options. Let's just increase the specular slightly. About 75. Okay. Next thing to do, just add some background layers in. So I'm just going to bring in the black solid, put it to the back, and then I'm going to add a ramp effect to that. Solo it so I can see what's going on. I've added the ramp effect. As you can see, I've set the start colour to the dark red to black at the end of the ramp, and I've set it to a radial ramp. I've also adjusted the position of the start, which is here, and the end, which is slightly out here. We can unsolo that layer now to see what that looks like. Okay, that's not looking too bad. We've got a bit of a black area here. We can do something about that. We can adjust this light, but what I think I'm going to do is just add another light in there for now. I'm just going to call it ambient. set that to an ambient light, set it to about 25%, and that would just generally light the whole scene slightly more. Now it'd be good to give the film title a bit of depth. Obviously in After Effects you can't actually have true 3D, but we can kind of fake that. The easiest way to do it is just to literally duplicate this layer and pull it back in 3D space. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to dupe that, select the other layer, position, and if we just scrub the Z value, you can see that it moves back. So if we kind of set that to say 50, 50 might be a bit too much, let's set it to 25. Also, I'm going to adjust the opacity. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do that several times, and it should give us a little bit of depth to the film text. So I've set that up, I've just duplicated it. So there's 4 layers, and you can see that the position changes by 25 units, and also the opacity decreases slightly. I mean, that's entirely up to you how you set that up. I'm going to select these 3 and just parent them to the main film reflection. 2 reasons for that. Firstly, I can now click on here and move it around, and obviously all the layers move with it. The other reason is I can select this layer, select scale, and I can scrub the Z value. Sorry, that's scrubbing all of them. Scrub the Z value, there you go, and then you can increase or decrease the kind of extrusion. I'm going to leave it how it is for now, but it just makes it easier to change if we need to later. So we can fold these up and move on to the next part. I've made a graphic to put in the background. Let's just have a quick look at that. It's done in Illustrator, and it's a kind of skyline. If we zoom in, you can see it's just made of loads of small squares. So what I'm going to do is just bring that into the After Effects comp and position it behind the text that we have. So let's just drag it in. I want it behind the floor as well. I'm going to make that a 3D layer. I'm just going to adjust the position and scale. I've adjusted the position and the scale of these. I've set them to continuously rasterize, and then I've duplicated the layer and positioned it slightly behind, and also reduced the opacity of that. That all looks good. I'm just going to add the CC toner effect to the front layer because it's very black and yellow, and what I want to do is kind of give it a slight red tinge. So I'll select the shadows here. I'm just going to select a kind of really, really deep red for that. Okay, you see it kind of blends in a little bit more, and mid-tones. A sort of dark mustardy yellow. Okay. You can see over here that the 3D layer of the buildings is intersecting the floor. Now I want that to be 3D, so we kind of get some multiplaning when the camera moves, but I do want it to be behind the floor, so what I'm going to do is duplicate this black solid, which is set to adjustment, and I'm going to use it again to break the 3D system into 2. So if I just duplicate this and drag it between the floor and the skyline, you can see what happens. There we go. Now the sort of cityscape's still going to work with the camera and remain 3D, but it's behind the floor layer. Once we've set up the camera, we may need to adjust the position of that. It looks a little bit low at the moment, but until we get the camera kind of and the composition framed correctly, we can just leave it like that for now. Now we've got a little bit more in the comp, I'm going to adjust the camera position so it is sort of framed how I want it for the final shot. Then that will aid me with positioning all the other elements. So bear with me, I'm just going to position that and I'll be right back. I've repositioned the camera using these settings, as you can see here, and I've also raised up the skyline so it looks a little bit better. Okay, the compositions is getting there now. I'm going to add some more elements into the background, and then we'll add a few more particle systems just to bring it to life. Okay, I'm just going to add some more elements into the comp. Just fold that up for a moment. So new solid, I'm just going to make this say 1200 by 700. I'm not really sure of the size, but that'll probably do. And press Y to drag the anchor point down into the corner. And then I can move this up so it's around there. What I'm going to do is just draw a quick mask on here to kind of simulate a sort of spotlight. So I'll just do that briefly. So I've drawn a kind of rough mask, renamed it Spotlight. I'm just going to add some feather to this. should do. Maybe a little bit more. And drag it to the bottom of the timeline, just above the background. Okay, so now I'm going to set some rotation keyframes. You can see I made this layer bigger because when we rotate it, otherwise you're going to get some clipping on the corners. Hopefully it'll be okay now. So I'll just press R, and now I'm just going to set a key at the beginning and the end. So that animates like that. Pretty basic stuff. Just going to reduce the opacity to that, to about 20. Okay, that looks about right. And the next thing I'm going to do, just duplicate that layer, and once I've done that, I'm just going to flip the scale. So I've set the X scale of the dupe solid to -100, so now you can see we've got two solids. Obviously the new one is going to need moving over here. And I think I'm going to need to adjust the rotation keyframes. And then it should look like this, which looks just fine. Okay, so we can unsolo those, and I'm going to add in a kind of starry sky for the background now. There we go. Okay, so for the starry sky, I'm just going to use a particle system. Quite simple setup. First of all, I'm just going to drag the black solid in, put it behind the spotlights. And for that, I'm going to use, if you go Simulation Particle Systems 2, it's a pretty basic 2D particle system, but it'll be fine for what we want. If I just rename this Starry Sky and solo this layer, we can see what's going on. Okay, you can see at the moment it's not exactly looking like a starry sky. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to adjust a few parameters so that we get the result we want. Now I want the particles to be produced over the whole of the image. So first of all, I'm just going to move the timeline down so I can see all the particles. I'm just going to go into physics, set the velocity to 0 so they don't move, and also gravity to 0 so they don't move. So now you can see it's just kind of generating all the particles in one place. So if we scrub these values for the producer size, we can kind of set it. Let's zoom out slightly. We can set it the size of our kind of project window. Okay, so there you go. So now that's working just fine. Now I'd like the particles to kind of sparkle a little bit and twinkle on and off, so there's two ways we could do this. We could produce lots of particles right at the very beginning and then stop the birth rate so that we fill the whole project with particles in one go, or we could set them so that they kind of gradually appear, live for a while and then fade out, and that's what I'm going to do. It should make for like a kind of twinkly sky, hopefully. So let's just scale this up so we can see what we're doing. Change it to a star particle type. I'm going to make these pretty small, 0.04, 0.04. Okay, so I've set this up. It's pretty basic, but it's fine for a background element. Notice I've set the birth rate to 0.5, so it's emitting particles quite slowly. They live for 2 seconds. The opacity map I've set to fade in and out, and the maximum opacity to 50, so although we don't have a massive amount of control over that, I mean that'll be fine for this. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set the colour to be less saturated and to be kind of similar, slightly warmer towards the depth, so they do kind of change colour a tiny bit, but not as drastic as yellow to red. Okay, so I mean that looks fine for now. So let's have a look at the whole comp and where we stand at the moment. So there's a RAM preview. It's all looking good. Now's probably quite a good time to save and then carry on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to add some particle effects in between the kind of text and the buildings. The buildings are a bit of a hog for scrubbing because they're quite large scaled up Illustrator files. So I'm just going to switch those off for the moment. Then I can kind of scrub through a lot easier. Now what I want to do is set the particles so they kind of emit at the point where the word sort of wipes on, so it's around here. And the particle system I'm going to use is going to be particle world, and that's a 3D particle system, and that's why, so it will match with the camera. So first of all, I'm just going to drag in a black solid, place it there, actually there, just above that, so it's above the kind of adjustment layer that's breaking the 3D. I'm just going to call this particle world dust. Effects simulation particle world. Okay, and there it's all going on. Actually, I want the particle system above the floor. Okay, there it is. If we go to our cam controller, we can kind of adjust the heading. We can move around and we can see whereabouts the particles are positioned. So we want them behind. We also need to bring up the floor so it's kind of level with the bottom of our text. So go back to particle world. In here we can adjust the height of the floor and we can adjust the position of the producer. So first of all, I'm just going to set those. I've raised the floor up to 0, so that's in the right place. And I've set the position to -0.15, so it's kind of in the centre. If we just go back to our controller and move around, we can then set the particles so that they're kind of further back in Z. 0.1 maybe. A little bit further. Okay. So for this first particle system, I'm going to set this up so it kind of looks a bit like some dust or something like that. And then in amongst that, I'll put a few sparkles and things. So let's do the dust one first of all. So we select particle world. I'm just going to go through and adjust the parameters, and then I'll show you what I've done. So I've changed a few settings, as you can see. I've just adjusted the radius of the producer and reduced the gravity down. At the moment it's kind of spewing out particles continually. Well, I only want that to happen at the point where the kind of last yellow wipe occurs, and it's just going to be a burst. So I'm just going to set some keys for that. Okay, the yellow circle wipe sort of starts around here. So I'm just going to trim that layer to there, and then I'm going to set some keys for the birth rate. First of all, I'm just going to set that to 0, add a key, jump forward 1 frame, and actually jump forward 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Set that to 20, and then jump forward another 5, and set that to 0. I'm just going to solo that layer and see what that looks like. Okay, it looks like this at the moment, so it's not really how I want it, but it's kind of getting there. I think the kind of particles move a little bit too fast, so I'm just going to add a little bit of resistance in there. So I'm going to set this to 1.5. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the colour of the particles. I'm going to start off with it kind of pinky kind of colour, and then go to dark red, like so. I'm not sure about that pink actually. I think that needs to be more orangey brown, just so it blends in with the background. So now they don't spread quite as far. Okay, that's looking okay. Doesn't really look like dust at the moment, does it? Let's just switch off the grid so that we can't see that. So it's just the particle system, and I'm going to add a box blur. I'm going to set this to 10 with 2 iterations. Okay, and now you can see it's sort of kind of resembling a dusty sort of explosion. Once we drop the opacity of that back and put it into the comp, that will fit in quite nicely. So to create the other particle systems, the easiest way is, rather than kind of set it all up again, I'm just going to duplicate this, rename it, and then adjust the parameters. I'm going to make this one stars. I'm going to use a custom kind of particle for this. Okay, so I'm just going to solo that layer and just adjust some of these settings. I'm not going to want the box blur at all, so I'll just take that off for now. Hit U to see my keyframes. Okay, at the moment it's still set to line. and it's emitting far too many particles for this. The reason there's that many before was because I knew I was going to blur it and make the kind of dust effect. So for what I'm going to do is I'm going to just set this to 5. I'm also going to have a look at the physics and take the resistance back down to 0. Okay, so what does this actually look like? Not too bad. I mean, they're spreading out quite nicely. Just adjust a few more of the settings. So I want to use a custom particle for this. So I need to make that first of all. So let's just go back to the project. I've actually got it from the previous demos, so I'm going to use this because that's the one I want to use. That's even better. So you drag this particle comp. It could be animating in here as well, by the way, but it's not for this. And we can hide that. Go back to particle world, and then in our particle type we can select textured quad polygon, and then we fold down texture and we can select star particle. Okay, so now that's working. Great stuff. Just drag this down so we can see our comp window a bit clearer. Let's just unsolo that layer so we can see them in situ. Okay, they're all whizzing off everywhere. I thought it would be quite cool if they actually bounce off the floor, because that would show you another little feature of particle world. Before I do that, I'm just going to go through these settings and see if we need to change anything. I think that maybe we could drag the X point of the emitter back this way, just so it's slightly more central, and also take it further back into the distance. So I'm going to just set this to kind of 0.3, so they kind of jump back, so they're definitely behind. I'm going to increase the radius of the emitter, say 0.6, 0.2 on Y, just so it's slightly bigger. Speed them up slightly, and increase the gravity. I'm also going to just come down to the particle size. I'm going to set the depth size to kind of 0.1, so they kind of scale down as they fade out. Now, as I said, I want them to kind of bounce on the floor. So we need to find the setting for that. Now, for particle world, it's in options. I'm just going to solo this layer. If you click options, you come up with this kind of quirky looking menu. If we select rendering, we can then choose ice, glue or bounce. Ice will slide, glue will stick, and bounce will bounce. So that's what we're going to do. If we OK that, there you go, you can see they're now kind of bouncing off the floor. If we switch the floor on, great stuff, and then let's just preview that. You can see that they're bouncing off the floor. So let's switch the floor back off, unsolo this, and have a quick preview of what it looks like so far. So this is what it looks like at the moment. I think the smoky thing is definitely too obvious, and the orange colour that I've picked is wrong. It should really have been more of a bluey red, I think, rather than going towards yellow. It just stands out too much. Other than that, I think it's all looking great. I'm going to add in one more particle system and adjust the colour of the dust. For the other particle system, it's going to be pretty similar to the stars. I'm just going to duplicate that, change the particle type, and adjust a few settings. I've adjusted the dust particle system. I've reduced the opacity and changed the colour slightly. I've also duped the stars particles and set it to faded sphere. Now, on a lot of particle systems, you have a seed value which you can change easily, and the seed will be used when it's calculating stuff, and if you change that, it will sort of randomise everything. Otherwise, what will happen when you duplicate your systems is that all the particles will be in the same place. Can't find that in particle world, so the only way I'm going to do this is to just adjust a few of the parameters, just so that all the particles don't follow exactly the same path. Otherwise, our faded spheres will be in the same place as our stars. So for that, I'm just going to adjust the velocity and the gravity so that they're travelling a little bit faster and maybe falling slightly slower. It will just give us a little bit of variation. I've increased the velocity and the gravity slightly. No, I've reduced the gravity actually. So they're not matching up. There looks like there's too many of those, so I'm just going to take that down to 4, so there's not quite as many. Okay, I think that should be good. I've changed the colours slightly and switched the skyline on, so let's just save the project and then do a round preview. There we go, all seems to be working okay. So the last thing we need to do for this project is just set up the camera move. I'm going to make the camera move quite simple. Let's just click Cam Controller. Press P for position and Shift E to open up our expression effects. Just going to fold these down so we can see the values and jump to the end of the timeline. I'm going to frame it at the end first of all because that's the kind of easier to do because we can't actually see the word at the very beginning. I'll frame the end shot, the heading at -35, pitch at 3, Z depth 1000, and there's the position values. I'm just going to select these keys, press F9 so it eases into that. Jump back to 1 second. Now I want to really start the camera move from the beginning, but as I said, you can't see the word film at the beginning, so we can kind of set it up here and then just drag our keys back. Okay, I probably want that to be about -10. Yeah, I mean that's quite a big difference. That's okay. Pitch -10, so we're kind of up above it a little bit more, and let's move in a little bit closer as well. -750. Maybe a bit too close, not sure. And then we'll probably just drag this X value across when After Effects wakes up. There we go. Okay. Although it's quite close to the edge, you know, it's not going to really matter with the title safe. By the time the word's legible, the camera will have pulled out far enough. So I'm just going to select all these keys, drag them to the beginning, and actually Control Command click those to make them linear. So I just want it to come straight out of there but ease into the end. So let's just do a quick round preview and see what that looks like. So there's the round preview. It's not looking too bad at all. We could keep going, you could add some glows and some sparkles and things like that. Unfortunately we don't have enough time in these lessons. I'd rather move on to something else next week. When you work on this project yourself, obviously you can add all those extra details and things like that and come up with something with a lot more finesse than I have. Hopefully that's given you some ideas of some approaches with using particles. Before we end the project, I'm just going to show you a couple of kind of things, so client changes, that kind of thing, how you can incorporate that into this workflow, because the way we've built this is it is quite versatile. So let's just stop this. I'm going to save it again and then we'll have a look at that, and that'll be the end of the lesson. So there's a few things in this project that make it easy to change. For instance, the client comes back to you and they've changed the word, so it now says movie. Okay, the easiest thing to do is just set up your movie Illustrator file the same as the film one. Command H to reload footage. If I select movie, open that up, and that should, and there you go. Because we've used an Illustrator file and it's in a pre-comp, that'll just ripple its way all the way through. So that worked just fine. Another thing they might say is, oh, we don't want it to be a star, or oh, we don't like the colour of the stars. Again, because we've used a repeater, we just need to select our one shape layer, our one poly star, and we can then change the settings for this. We can change the colour for it. So I've now just made it orange. When we come back to our main comp, again, that's going to ripple through. Obviously you're going to need to go in and adjust the colours of some of the particle systems and things like that to match, but generally it's quite easy to make changes in a thing like this. Okay, I've just undone that. One last kind of point about it would be that if you were actually doing this as a job, you'd probably be producing kind of a few of these, one for the film section, one for the music section, you know, one for news maybe. because we've set this up like this, it would be pretty simple to do. All you need to really do is kind of start at the transition, duplicate that, take your layer map, which is film at the moment, change it to movie, bring that in, okay, and you just swap the layer down here for the new comp. That will work just fine. Again, with your stars and dots, you can dupe those to change the shape, and then you just carry on through duplicating these and renaming them, so music, reflection, etc., music main, and then you'd end up with kind of almost exactly the same comp but with a different word. Presumably you'd use slightly different colours. Then just trying to change the camera animation, and you've got that animation done. The thing is, you'll only change a few elements, so there'll be a nice continuity between all the animations in the program. But from your point of view, you've made it once, and then you don't really need to make it again. You're just going to change the assets that build it up. So that's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed the lesson. This week we kind of covered particle systems that come with After Effects, and we've created a kind of small little title for a kind of pop or youth program. We've learned how to fake 3D reflections, and we've set up a simple camera rig as well. Next week what we're going to do is we're going to create another project, but we're going to be using Trapcode Particular and possibly Trapcode Form. So if you don't already have those plugins, I suggest you go to www.trapcode.com, have a look at what it does, and if you click the links from there, I think it takes you to Red Giant Software, where you can download a demo version, and then you can follow along with the lesson next week. For those of you that are actually taking the After Effects course for the full term, thanks very much. I'll see you next week. Everyone else, thanks for watching the previews. So that's Tim Clapham for FX PhD signing out for another week. Have a good one.